Hello everyone, it's been a little bit since I've done one of these. We went over some pretty awesome matches last week with Frank Karsten. I think that was last week. I'm getting my timeline all mixed up because of the holiday, so I apologize for any kind of delay in content because of that, but I hope everyone had a great one. If you don't celebrate, that's fine. Hope you guys did something fun with your time. But we have a Continental coming up. The European Continental coming this weekend. It is right now as recording, just a few days away. And yeah, we got to get a breakdown going on because there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of different variations of decks, and I think there's 7 decks that I would respectably say are competitive for right now, and things I would expect to see. You can only prepare for so much, and this is what I got. This is everything I'm looking at and everything that I expect to see this weekend. Different variations of different decks for sure, but it's really hard to discern what exactly people are playing. Maybe someone found something that works that I couldn't find. I'm trying everything from left to right, and sure there are some wonky combos here and there, and a lot of different kind of archetypes you can take, but ones that can really stand up against the aggressive decks, the disruptive decks, the control decks, and the whole in the world decks are all kind of all over the place. So let's stop chit chatting about it. Let's dive right in. So, what have I been doing? Well, I think any of you have been following the Cross Continental Challenge, named TBD, have seen the Diggy Diggy Hole, I like to say. It's the Dwarven Mine, Amber Steel aggressive deck that uses some light control elements in Cinderella and the songs, along with Pete and a bunch of other stuff to kind of control the board. Seven Dwarves Mine being the marquee card there. Lilo to kind of bring things back and have some staying power against Be Prepared decks. And, I hope you get a decent aggressive stance against Sisu, and that's really what we're doing here. I've had some success with it. I think I'm 1-2 in the event itself, but I've had really close losses, and it's not really something I think that really were contributing to my losses were player draw. I think it was just a lot of really good games and against really good players, so it happens. If you think of it that way, I would have had essentially 3 splits in this event. I've been 1-2, 1-2, and 2-1, which unfortunately, to recap, the Continental event is best of 2, 7 rounds day 1, closed deckless as of now. Again, we'll see if anything changes between now and then. I think for EU it might be a little late as of now, but hopefully for NA maybe that changes, who knows. But yes, the only real change, I've liked a lot of what the deck has done. It's really played the aggressive role quite well. The amount of steel decks, and specifically the Amethyst steel variations of decks, has kind of cropped up more than I thought it would, making cards like Piglet a little bit worse. Happy is fine into Emerald Steel and other steel variants to help check Diablo, but it will die quite often, and sometimes isn't the greatest to draw late in the game. So what I've really done with this deck is I removed a Happy, a Piglet, and a Pluto, and added 3 copies of the big Kita, the 5-cost Kita. What I really was missing was some power, some late game kind of effect. And while that's not always what the deck wants, because it does want a consistent opening start, there are plenty of things to play on turns 1 and 2 already in the deck. 11 1-drops along with a plethora of 2-drops. I think the most amount of 2-drops I've ever seen in a deck. Really just means you want something else to play maybe the turn after turn 4, where you get to deploy almost all your hand out. Kita is a dramatic effect on the game. It can protect your entire board that you've been questing with that may be a little vulnerable at this point. You've been fighting back and forth against steel. Some of the Amethyst decks have really good challengers, Mim Fox, Crab, all these things. If you can shut them down for a full turn, I think it's more than enough to kind of get through. And even against some of the steel decks that try and, challenge everything late in the game, opposing Calhouns and such, Kita really shuts everything down. It's really so far the only change I wanted to make to the deck. I think we were locked into the decks that we've been playing in the Continental Challenge, and we can't change cards. That's fine. It's basically like a tournament that's taking place over several weekends, or weeks, I guess. But if I could change anything, this would be the only change I would have made. Everything else has been really impressive. Calhoun, I think in this deck is fine as a 4 of. I think in other decks it's going to be seen as a 3 of, just because it's the uninkable count. This is a little bit high on the uninkable counts in general. Again, it's about 16 with Calhoun, Storm, Doc, and what's the other one here? Daisy Duck. And they've all been fine. They're all cards you want to play out. You want to always play your Daisy. You always want to play your Calhoun. They're pretty powerful, and Storm always wants to get sung as soon as possible. Kind of going through what I'm going to do here as well is list off some matchups. I don't have a graphic for it, unfortunately, but if you're listening in, that's all the better. Matchups you want to play against, matchups you don't want to play against. So I'm going to go through several decks here. We're going to go through, let me bring up my little note here. Blue Steel is a contender. Amber Steel decks are a contender. Amethyst Emerald, Emerald Steel, Amethyst Steel, Ruby Amethyst, and Ruby Sapphire. Those are the 7 decks I think are really viable, what we're going to go through here. So of those decks, The only ones you really don't want to face, and I think you may have some problems with at points, are bigger versions of the steel decks. I think if you're trying to be aggressive or people are trying to play, more of a controlling game, I think this is a really good way to be slightly bigger than the aggressive decks and have a little bit more removal to fight them, but be way under the control decks. So you're really looking to dodge a lot of the mid-range decks, meaning the more mid-range versions of Emerald Steel might be an issue. The traditional Steel Song versions, which I'm not going to go through too much, I haven't had too much success with it this expansion, would be more of an issue. You could see that in the previous video against Frank Karsten. We went through our match. We both agree that, typically in mirror match type matchups, the person or the deck that goes a little bit bigger, a little bit slower, generally has an advantage. That's definitely the case. So I'm fine with this deck into Ruby Sapphire. I'm fine with this deck into, the hyper aggressive decks. So even Emerald Amethyst sometimes is a, basically the same deck as we are, just a different looking shell. Mim Fox is the only card that really gives us problems out of Amethyst. Ruby Amethyst, red purple is a deck I don't mind as well. They have some things to fight, but really it's going to come down to the foxes and the crabs to help contest the board, and Kita does a pretty good job at helping that as well. Not so many great brawl targets for them to stymie early, and their locations aren't really that big of an issue. Be Prepared's a little bit slow, and they don't have cards like Big Sisu all the time. Sometimes they do, but I think without Ice Block, I don't really care too much about Big Sisu. So this is a very well-rounded deck. I would say against the majority of the field, this would be a fine choice. You're really going to come down to some of the specific draws. Sometimes the deck clunks a little bit up. You want certain pieces. You can draw too much of the aggressive elements in matchups where you need to kind of help check the board. Strength of the Raging Fire and Storm are some of the best cards in the deck. There's no real room for cards like Along Came Zeus. But this deck does have game against pretty much everything. And again, if you're going to the LCQs, it is a strong choice. I think it's very powerful. It's very aggressive, but also has the staying power with card draw like Doc, with card draw like Rapunzel, and just large characters at cheap rates, Daisy Duck being a 1/4, me being a 3/3, Lawrence being a 4/4, and Rapunzel and Pluto to help kind of round out the curve with Kita to protect. So solid choice. Pretty big fan still. I haven't really been proven wrong too much. I've considered taking its North American challenge, but I think we have way too much time before then for me to solidify actually what I would play in any kind of way. But yeah, this is one of the first decks I would say is a contender for people to play at the European Challenge, whether it be LCQs or the main event itself. I would recommend this deck for sure. Personal bias aside. So next up, we have a deck that's kind of been, we're shifting gears here. The little imagery shifted. A little bit off put by a lot of the metagame. And this is more of an experimental version of it for people who really are diehard Blue Steel players. I'm going to say Blue Steel, Sapphire Steel. A lot of the issues that has been coming up from this deck has been the inability to challenge properly against decks that play Daisy. Sometimes even getting through a Diablo is difficult. Really the aggressive starts we've seen R&B play and the Cross-Continental Challenge have issues with the Amber Sapphire aggro deck, which I can't imagine possibly beating ever, really. So good on them for at least winning a game. But some of the interesting takes here with this deck is you'll see there are 4 copies of Grab Your Sword. This came at the recommendation of a friend of mine who I trust with a lot of, play styles and philosophy about deck building, and it's basically to the point where Tinkerbell Swords isn't really enough to kill a lot of things. I mean, if you think about it, Tink Swords doesn't even kill a Calhoun. 3 health is really, or 3 willpower is kind of not really the barrier to entry, as you can even see in the previous deck we were just looking at. We have cards like Daisy Duck, we have Lawrence. Those things are out of range of those kind of things, and other decks are either don't care about their characters dying with they're playing a more controlling style deck, or they're just bigger and harder to deal with. Grab Your Swords, I think, may have its time in the sun in this style of deck. I wouldn't recommend it the same way in traditional Amber Steel songs, but I think here it actually might have a place, and 4 is where I want to be. Speaking of one of the bigger problems in 4 health characters that have been popping up everywhere, everyone is well aware of Genie, how good the card is, making its kind of point known, and some of the decks we'll see in just a moment, but pretty much every Amethyst deck, there's a reason that the Genie is $14 US right now on TCG Player and the like. It is just a very powerful card, and it's hard to deal with. So that's why we actually see the inclusion of the set 1, Robin Hood. I don't have the name big enough to see right now, but it can replace itself, which helps combat Genie's card advantage. And on top of that, it can help challenge and take out Genies. It's pretty hard to deal with at that point. It can also help take out Shark Maui if you have a 1 damage effect from like a Tinkerbell. So if they are able to, or if they quest with it into the Robin Hood, and then you have Tinkerbell to help finish off, it's unlikely that'll play out how we want it to, but it's possible. It's a fine card advantage engine as well in its own right against some of the green steel discard effects. What you need to do in a lot of cases is set up a shift character, a big character to then sing a whole new world, and this helps with Fishbone Quill to help buffer your hand against some of the discard effects from green steel, whether it be Sudden Chill sung with Ursula. You get to help have 3 cards in the hand at that point. If you don't play anything out in the early turns, it doesn't replace itself. So we see that kind of doing what it did in set 1 against cards like You Have Forgotten Me, against the Ursula double sing Sudden Chill lines, which can come up. The main win conditions for this deck, of course, still are Aerial and Tamatoa. I think the split's been correct for a while. 3 Tamatoa, 2 Aerial. I had that in Chicago in set 4 during the Bucky era, and I wasn't certain about it being correct then, but I think now, because this deck only is, I think, playing 13 Uninkables, maybe 12, I'm not doing the math right now, there is room for Aerial, where previously One Trip Ahead was taking up the Sail the Outright Sea slot, and we didn't have Tipo at the time. If we're going to be doing this type of thing and type of deck, we really want to make sure we're consistent and close the game quickly. And that's why we see 1 Prepare Your Bot. Sorry, my cat is being a little needy right now. He's whining at me. You might see him in a minute. We're basically live here if he wants to come over. But yes, Aerial and Tamatoa, we see 1 Prepare Your Bot as kind of a surprise win factor. Sometimes you just need to have the ability to turn the corner very quickly. If you have a Lucky Dime developed, an Aerial played, and then you activate Dime on Aerial gaining 5, just 1 Prepare Your Bot is actually enough to win the game. Come here, buddy. I'm taking a brief break. Maybe I'll edit that, maybe not. All right. We have my best friend here, Sir Sage. Say hi. He was whining at me to come up here. So we have that going on now, too. Thank you for your patience and understanding. I'm not the greatest at editing videos. So Prepare Your Bot's a kind of a catch-all answer to make things happen. It has duality in some ways when you get to immediately use a Fishbone Quill twice in a turn when you're about to play Whole New World. You essentially can view it as a Tipo. That's a 1-cost Tipo effect on Fishbone Quill, because you're essentially throwing away a card in hand to ink another card, which isn't normally great, but when you're playing Whole New World or about to, and you access cards, it's fine. You're net neutral on ink as well when you do that. So no way to recur that effect, just having 1 is fine, and it's inkable, so it's not too big of a deal if you just draw it at some point in the game early where it's not necessary and you're trying to develop your ink to play Whole New World. But the main takeaways from this, I would say, is I do think that playing cards like Baboom and Smash are kind of necessary again because of how aggressive decks can be. Tipo helps a little bit in conjunction with Smash against Daisy and other 4-health characters. Pete is kind of a catch-all and helps develop boards into Be Prepared, which can be an issue out of Blue-Red. There is no item removal or location hate in this deck. That is another big part of the deck, and one of its potential flaws. I think we're very character-centric right now. I've seen many lists of Ruby Sapphire and Ruby Amethyst. Sorry, Ruby Amethyst, not Ruby Sapphire. Eschewing even Queen's Castle in a lot of cases, and in that kind of world, I don't really want to be playing Hideaways or other things like that, even though it can be very crucial against Lucky Dime. We've seen Sailor and other people who have played Blue-Red to their credit, eschew even a copy of Lucky Dime. They're down to 1 and playing Maui plus Pirate's Life to help close things out as a way to help fight some of the aggressive strategies as well. He already left me. How rude. But yes, that is where I'm at with this deck. I think it's a contender. It has some flaws. It's, I don't think, favored. It's a strange deck. It is out of the decks we mentioned before. Again, Amethyst Steel, Ruby Amethyst, Ruby Sapphire, Amber Steel, Emerald Amethyst, Emerald Steel, and Blue Steel Mirrors. I don't know if that is favored against any single one of them instinctively, except for Green Steel, except for Emerald Steel. That's the one deck I do think that the deck is favored into. There's enough removal, grab your swords, and card draw with Hiram and Whole New World to kind of get around a lot of what they're doing. That's one of the reasons that we played this deck so much in Chicago when Bucky was first trying to take over. Very strong matchup into that with Cogsworth, Tinkerbell, grab your swords, all these things. I played that deck for that specific reason. But aside from that specifically, this deck is very finicky as how it can work. It can be the best deck in the room or the worst deck in the room, and it really depends. There's really no in between on that, and it's again going to come down to the matchups, how things play out, what your opponent's mulliganing for, how they decide to prepare, if they have any kind of game plan, and how the draws come out. But it is a very powerful deck. Two of the most powerful cards in the game are Whole New World and Fishbone Quill, and pairing them together really just seems right half the time. So this is where I'd be at if I was trying to do that type of deck. And I do think it's powerful, but I would say you're about even with everything at best. People have thought that the Ruby Sapphire matchup is unfavorable. I've not really always thought that. I thought it was more of a coin flip, or very close, if anything. It really depends. You can add more copies to Let It Go if you expect more Ruby Sapphire, and not as many Grab Your Swords, of course. But having 4 Grab Your Swords, I think, is a necessity if you want to play this type of deck. Tala and Pete are helping, come up the early game. Tala is really there to help check Flynn while kind of buffering your hand a little bit in the early game if you haven't found exactly what you need. But Cogsworth has our only 5, and a plethora of 6s to get to with Fishbone Quill. Fishbone Quill is the most important card in this deck, where a lot of Ruby Sapphire decks have eschewed it. But I'm a fan. I'm going to give it a try. This might be what I play at the Charlie's Collectible event in 2 weeks. Not the week of the championship, but the weekend after in Atlanta. So if you're not going to that, you should go there. You'll see me there. That'll be a lot of fun. But I want to give it a try. And I do believe in testing, this deck has performed well enough to where I would consider it. And it is certainly a deck that if you're expecting a lot of Emerald decks, definitely a deck I would take. Has a good matchup into those for the most part, especially Green Steel. Emerald Amethyst, a little bit less so, but with 4 Grab Your Swords, I think it's fine. We're going to move right along here. Speaking of Emerald Amethyst, we've seen Artifacts do fantastically well with his deck in the Cross-Continental Challenge. I've agreed with a lot of the deck choices. I respect his opinion on a lot of card selection and things like that. There are a few things that I've wanted to change with the deck, and cards I've really felt strongly about when it comes to how to build this deck. Primarily Gazelle. Gazelle has been really impressive in testing both aggressively and defensively when playing the deck. It helps check Diablo, which is one of the biggest problems that this deck does have, in the fact that even on turn 1, if you have a Chernobog's Followers in play, which you are seeing Chernobog's Followers over Magic Room specifically because of Gazelle, as long as there's no Let the Storm Rage on or Hidden Cove, you can always make Gazelle give Followers Evasive to challenge a Diablo on turn 2. They only get 1 card out of the deal, and it's pretty nice. We do see 5 1 cost 2 lore characters that Gazelle also helps protect, in addition to Bonsai, which I've been less of a fan of, but I think it's still necessary to have a better game against Ruby Amethyst, just a card that you can quest with into Foxes. And of course Go-Go Tamago, which has proven its metal 10 times over. It's one of the best cards in the deck, and I really couldn't see playing this deck without 4 of them. We have the 2-cost Ursula, of course, Madam Fox. No snakes is one thing to note. And I know that's a little weird, and I'm probably going to get flack for that bit here, but in a deck that doesn't want to kind of mess around as much with bounce effects, there are some things to bounce which are fine, but I really think that Snake is a card that we are playing because it was really good at helping stall the game out and protecting some of your cards. Sure, you can reset one of your 1-cost 2-lore characters, but I really feel like Gazelle is a better card in that same sense there, helping play offense and defense a lot better than Snake does without having to spend more ink to replay the card. Yes, the synergies between Goat and Merlin are lessened, but in a sense, this is an aggressive deck, and I want to keep my characters in play for the most part. Meta Fox being the exception, it is too powerful of an effect, 4/3 with Rush, I think, to really let go of. It's just too strong. And our 3-drop slot is quite cluttered, let's just say. Fox, Crab, White Rose, and Kit. I think Kit is also one of the other concessions to Diablo. And Ursula on the other side, of course, just things you need to have in play to help deal with out of other Emerald decks. And it can even buy some time against a high room if they really need to draw cards or things like that. But the deck is pretty self-explanatory. I think that with this deck, you're basically favored to beat up most of the Ruby-based decks. I think you have a strong matchup against all of them. Diablo 1 the Amethyst Diablo has really been a big part of that as well. It's an additional threat you can deploy and not feel too bad about if it gets Be Prepared or Seasued, because it's on dice and only costs 1, versus previously when you had to play Brooms, you had the option to sometimes cycle it but not have a threat present for the later turn. So Diablo helps change quite a bit, I believe. We're seeing Genie over for Rabbits. Of course, less bounce effects, and also the staying power and evasive of 2 lore is just too strong. Still playing 4 Elsas. It is one of the best cards to have in your deck just as a catch-all. It can help challenge a bunch of things you need to deal with, whether it be opposing Ursula, Ariel, anything really. And the big Ursula, not too keen on it as far as a game plan. It is more of a threat that's kind of omnipresent. It just exists, and it must be respected at times, and it can be very powerful at times. Making your Ursulas go +2 lore is a big deal when shifted, and also sometimes you play against a Songs deck and it has a dramatic effect. But it's a very low opportunity cost to include a card like Ursula, Sea Witch, Sea Queen. 7 cost Ursula, very low opportunity cost to put in your deck because it can just be inked and has a very high impact late in the game. We want to see more cards like that exist in the game, I think. And yeah, it's just a pretty much, I think, an auto include in this type of deck just as a potential threat to respect. When you're playing in this European Challenge, yes, so far we know that the day 1 is closed deck list, so it's unknown whether you have it or not, but in day 2, it is really important to have cards that your opponent has to respect. You'll see sometimes there are one-ofs in decks, and those are particularly good in open deck list parts because it's really hard to play around so many different things and remember all of them that can potentially happen at all times. And just the presence of them in your deck list, while being inkable most of the time, is just very strong. And one of the best things to make your opponents do is make mistakes. And how they play around things or what they choose to play around because of the knowledge they have is a big skill testing part. So when you get to kind of have those experiences and opportunities to make your opponent make mistakes, it's a great part of just normal deck building that has a high upside anyway. So I'm a fan. Artifacts has definitely shown that this deck has a lot of merit. Has more play. I think he's beaten Green Steel twice. Granted, again, they were both 2-1, so in best of 2, they've been splits. I don't think it was primarily play draw dependent, but I could be wrong. But yes, it is a strong archetype, and I expect to see quite a bit of this style of deck, not this particular deck list potentially, but this style of deck, probably with snakes over gazelles, but I'm still arguing that gazelle is exceedingly powerful. Just as an option to help deal with things later where you get to followers trade with Diablo, play Gazelle to trade off, then you get to pick it up again with Fox, and the ability to challenge anything that's evasive kind of is looming the rest of the game, and that's pretty strong. But yes, this is where I would be at with this style of deck. Moving to the next setup here, we're talking about Emerald decks, and here's an interesting take. So there's been a lot of debate of how to build these style of decks, right? There's the Green Steel decks we've seen. I think Zan initially when he's playing the Lorcana Cross Continental Challenge, the only card in this deck that was new I think was 1 Pluto, and I don't think that's fair. I don't think it's correct. I think that some of the cards in the deck have allowed the deck to kind of change roles a little bit, and while the discard aspect is very strong, it is also very slow. What we've noticed a lot in these events and these people playing is that the format has sped up quite a bit, where I think Prince John might be just too slow for what it does now. Even against me yesterday when I was playing Collars a couple days ago, I don't remember exactly when it was, he had Prince John and You Have Forgotten Me, and he just didn't have time to play it going second at all. And that's kind of what I expect to see from a lot of people in this next event, where if you have an Ursula that survives for a turn, there's no way you can sing a discard effect and expect to be in the game still, except against someone who's dirtling around, except against Ruby Sapphire, which you can say that's why Sudden Chill is kind of in the deck and Hypnotize. They're not good cards. You'll see one Sudden Chill, and I'll get to that in a minute here, but I do believe that Heffalumps and Woozles is a card that this deck really, really wants, and it serves functionality against every deck. Stopping people from questing is one of the most powerful things you can do. It's really like removing a character for a full turn. Sure, they can challenge, but half the time they're not able to challenge, half the time their challenges don't matter. But Heffalumps and Woozles is a really impressive card. It slows aggressive decks down when you need it to. Late in the game, it's a great top deck because it takes away, essentially, it removes 2 of your opponent's lore and draws a card. And not to mention, against Sapphire decks, it stops a Hiram from questing, it stops a Tamatoa from questing, potentially a Mufasa even from questing. All of those things really want to quest, and some of the best characters in the game have benefits when they quest. So stopping them from doing that, even against an upright Diablo, you can play it and they can't quest, so they're forced to play a song off of the Diablo if they have something to exert it, has a lot of versatility. And mainly the fact that it replaces itself, getting some more card advantage with the Ursula as opposed to making your opponent discard, is very, very powerful. Heffalumps is a card I expect to see a ton of, and really being able to control the entire board with Muses and Heffalumps is something I expect Green Steel to kind of shift towards. Speaking of shifting, there's still Morph here. I think Morph into Beast and Tinkerbell is very threatening. Obviously, Morph also being able to set up shift Diablos to let you sing on turn 3 as well as develop a 3-cost card is extremely powerful. Some of the best setups in the game that you can play involve taking advantage of multiple things happening in the same turn, and songs are letting you do that. So Morph kind of adding to that part where you get to shift and sing a song on the same turn. Great inclusion. You'll see one Captain Hook. More of a respect that you kind of want another 1-drop in this deck most likely. You probably want a couple more, but I don't think the deck can afford to play it, honestly. I think that the power level of the deck is kind of constrained in some of its more expensive cards. So having few cards that cost 1 and impactful cards that cost 2, 3, and 4 is really where it's at. We talk about how this deck functions and the space it occupies. It's right above most of the other mid-range decks. As far as what it does, it strips cards like Whole New World, Storm, Strength, all those things. Even Be Prepared and tries to then go under the Ruby Sapphire decks while still maintaining enough control against the aggressive decks. And I really feel like this deck does it quite well. One of the things that this deck is kind of built for is open deck list in some way. The one Sudden Chill, you can see it says no discard. Sure, there's a discard effect in Ursula, a discard effect on Sudden Chill, fine. And I guess Bruno, we don't talk about him though. But Sudden Chill is a very paralyzing card where even if you ink it at some point, which this deck doesn't really want to play it often, it can. Obviously when drawn, it can be very devastating at the right time. But really, even if it's inked at some point, your opponent has to play in such a way where they respect it. So in a closed deck list situation, once you ink it, then they have to respect it for the rest of the game, potentially being a card you can play or draw to because they know you have one. They don't know how many, but they know you have one. In an open deck list, it is something to always have them to consider as well. Until they see it played or inked, they have to consider it as well. So just by it existing, either inking in closed deck list or being in the deck, an open deck list, is a very powerful effect to have. Even though I don't think this deck really wants it, I think it's something that can really, again, paralyze your opponent's decision-making process. We see here, moving on from that, one Ana in conjunction with some other one-ofs. Ana is a very good card. When you play it, being able to reuse it with 3 copies of the Muses, which I think has gotten stronger in this set, especially with Heffalumps and Woozles, being able to kind of stop your opponent from questing, bouncing something else as well, really giving you a lot of time to set up and keep drawing cards with the Diablo. Very powerful. Pluto being a great follow-up as well, much like Muses to Ursula, while not being vulnerable to Big Sisu, and protecting Ursula against Maui is really strong. Something you kind of want against some of the Ruby decks. Beast and Tinkerbell don't really need too much of an introduction, neither does Pete. A couple copies of Baboon to make sure that you can answer Diablos, aside from the songs, and I think that Storm, Strength, and Bruno, I think you really do need some piece of hard removal in this deck. Ana is some form of it, kind of, being able to kill a damaged character, but Bruno is just a good song to have and answer anything you need to late in the game. 3 Cove is, I've never really liked Cove in this deck because it's often been a bad top deck late in the game, but the more I've seen the format develop, the more I've seen Ruby Sapphire cutting Maui's, the 6 cost Maui, or the 5 cost Maui that rushes, and other decks being worse and worse at challenging. It's ink, of course, but it has a very high impact in the game where it's drawn against any steel deck, so I think it's fine to include here. But this is a different take. Again, Go-Go being recurred with Muses is incredibly powerful as well, giving you some reach, what this deck never really had reach, is super, super awesome. Making some of your burn spells late in the game, Baboom and Storm on a Tamatoa type effect, really have some relevance. You can, with Ursula in play, and you can play a couple 1-drops out, Strength, Tamatoa, and then play a Go-Go for 6. It's really impressive. Or you can just kill it, I guess, by playing the Go-Go, but who knows? You might be at 14 lore. But anyway, strong choice. I, for some reason, don't think that green steel has been as represented in Europe as it was in North America for whatever reason. But in any case, I think it's a very strong choice. It's hard to argue with consistency. As far as matchups go, the only matchup I wouldn't be super thrilled with playing into sometimes is more traditional steel song. It does have the ability to kind of go over and go faster, especially with Naveen. If they're playing Grab Your Swords, for sure, to help kick out Diablos. Grab Your Swords not as important against a version with no Prince Johns, but still. I would say that was one deck I don't really want to play against, and it can be dicey against Ruby Sapphire, depending on how the draws go without extra discard effects. That is the one matchup where you kind of wish you had a little bit more. But then again, also Prince John, there's no way to protect it ever from a big Sisu. So with those being played more and hard to get rid of without all the right pieces coming together, it can be a problem there too. But I like the deck. I think it's very strong. It's very punishing against a lot of the aggressive decks. It's very punishing against a lot of the mid-range decks, being able to kind of get a Diablo down quick, disrupt you, draw a bunch of cards, and go from there. So green steel is what green steel does. It's still here. So next up, speaking of steel, fan favorite. And again, unique-ish take to it in some ways. We see a lot of the same elements we've seen in other decks. As I mentioned before, kind of like the same split of Genie, Merlin, Goat, and Merlin Rabbit as Amethyst, Emerald, and some of the same 1-drop choices as Amethyst, Emerald. There is a couple snakes here where there wasn't before. I think this deck has a bit different way to play than the Amethyst, Emerald deck does, and doesn't have a card like Gazelle to really help challenge Diablo. Instead, it has removal. It has Baboom, Smash, and Fire the Cannons. I think a split is fine. A couple copies of the Friends. I've seen people play Doc in this slot. I think you want Friends because I think Doc and Genie really clash in what they want to do, and Rabbit as well. And I really think that you need Rabbit and Genie to help contest some of the Ruby decks late in the game. You can't always afford to empty your hand. You really need to play a little bit more cautiously, and Doc kind of forces you not to play cautiously and just put everything to play. And I have seen other versions of the deck play Along Came Zeus instead of Strength, but I really value being able to ink my removal in matchups where it's poor to help develop more threats and not just be stuck with Along Came Zeus in hand. Tinkerbell Fast Flyer is the biggest addition, really pairing up with Tinkerbell Giant Fairy, making it kind of have the same impressive curve of Smee, Tinkerbell, and Genie that we have seen out of some of the early versions of Amethyst Steel. But Tinkerbell Giant Fairy just being this omnipresent threat that your opponent has to respect. There's a fast flyer in play, really, really paralyzing again what your opponent can do and make their choices with. And I've been very impressed with that kind of dynamic of the deck where your opponent wants to race, wants to get under you. They may have no choice but to race depending on how much removal they may or may not have and how fast your start was, but you can also kind of adapt a more controlling role with the removal that you have, the card draw you have, and the Tinkerbells being able to challenge in some ways. You could even use the shift line of Tinkerbell to take out a naked Diablo, meaning just a 2/2 Diablo, where you challenge it with the fast flyer, ink your 4th ink, and then shift the Tinkerbell, dealing 1 more damage to the Diablo. Even though the big Tinkerbell can't challenge the Diablo, the 1 damage takes it out. It is a good way to kind of help take out Diablos if you need to in a pinch without some of your other removal spells. But one of the other conclusions here that I've really liked with this deck is Bell. It is interesting because Genie on Genie violence is something that we'll see. While you can certainly crab a Genie to kill a Genie, being able to use a Genie to hit a Genie and then Bell your Genie actually leaves you with a Genie that's more healthy than you would otherwise if you had crabbed it. As well as being a 5 cost 4/4/2 lore, which isn't that bad at all. It also works really well with Elsa, which is hard to, again, sometimes hit on the crack back because it's evasive. Moving the damage around can get around some of the resist characters. I've seen Calhoun's be taken out by Bell because moving 2 damage gets around the resist and just deals it 2. That happened, oddly enough, one time when I was playing where I had a Genie that had 1 damage on it, a Bell in hand, and I was facing a Cinderella that had just traded with my Merlin Goat. So the big Cinderella had, as resist 2, as a 5/5, had 2 damage on it because they challenged a 4-cost character, and then I had a Fire the Cannons, which I Fire the Cannons my own Genie, and then moved 3 damage to the Cinderella, which gets around resist. So it's kind of a cute little way of using Fire the Cannons and Bell, but it is a very strong card, and I think a lot of the Calhouns that we see being played now, you can even use with Smee, of course, with Bell, really just ways to use that damage effect pretty nicely, getting around tons of different effects, resist, and just having more removal in a reasonable bodied character as well. The 4/4 is nice. But yeah, one of these things about this deck is that it always looks amazing on paper. Sometimes it has a bit difficulty playing out some games. I would say this deck is very strong. It's somewhat soft to traditional Steel Song, I would say, which I know I mentioned a few times. I've not really experimented too much with traditional Steel Song, but looking at some of the stats for people who are playing in the North American Challenge, the amount of Ruby Sapphire that was used to qualify for the Nationals via the challenges or whatever has kind of deterred me from wanting to play that in North America. I think traditional Steel Song is fine in Europe. It really just depends on the metagame we expect. But it also, the most played deck to qualify for European Nash was Ruby Amethyst, and then second was Ruby Sapphire. So those Ruby decks, if you want to beat up on the Ruby decks, I think that's why we see so much Emerald Amethyst be played, because it really does beat up on the Ruby decks. But back to this deck, it looks great on paper. Sometimes it's a little bit not as controlling as Ruby Amethyst, and also not as aggressive as Amber Steel can be. So it operates a really strange middle ground, but it does do a lot of things really well depending on the right matchup and how the draws come together. It looks fantastic on paper because in theory it can beat everything. You don't really need to answer Tamatoas when you're just gaining a bunch of lore with your evasive characters and drawing a bunch of cards with your rabbits. And your 1-cost characters always recycle, so it's not too vulnerable to removal early. Been a big fan of this in testing. It is a front runner for me to try out as well at the Charlie's Collectibles 10K or 8K. I don't know what it is this time. I know that first place is the same amount of payout, so that's all I cared about since I won the last one. So if you want to try and beat me and take the title, go for it. But this was a strong choice. Again, the non-song spells in the deck, the Cannons, Baboom, and Smash, are really to help dodge. They all serve a little bit different functionality and dodge Ursula, which is a big deal. Strength is just too powerful of a card and is inkable, where I think Zeus serves similar functionality. Of course, it can hit locations if need be, and isn't contingent on characters in play, but strength is just such a strong effect, and in conjunction with Pete, really can help reclaim a board that may be lost, where you get to Pete, ensure that you have at least something in play, maybe play a Genie afterwards, and then sing with the Pete to then kill a Diablo, along those lines as well. But a lot of different ways to build this deck, but I think this is where I would be at if I was taking it to the European Continentals. Again, I would think I would want to avoid with this deck Amber Steel in most variations. There are times where you're going to be fine into Amber Steel. Again, this deck has essentially two halves to it, that if you draw the right half in the right matchup, it's going to be great. The card advantage side and some of the removal heavy kind of clunkiness to it, but I think some of the clunkiness was actually wrapped into the fact that previously we're playing a lot of bounce cards. We're only playing 6 now as opposed to the 8 previously, and also shift lines where I had Robin Hood before. I think Robin Hood was also a little bit too clunky. The shift line of Tinkerbell is a bit more powerful than Robin Hood, so I do think it does warrant a slot where the Robin Hood shift line did not. But yeah, on this deck, this is where I'd be, again, a contender for what I'm going to play. Maybe Blue Steel, maybe Amethyst Steel. At the 8K, I want to try other stuff out and see how it goes. Next up here, last two, speaking of the Ruby decks, we'll start with this one. So there was a tournament in California that was won by, I think, Edmund Chu, I believe his name is. I'm bad with names. And it had a slight variation of Ruby Amethyst that I wasn't familiar with. I only had 2 B prepared that had 2 Dragonfires. I've adapted some ideas from that here and built this version of the deck. The idea behind the Dragonfires was that you used Maui Shark to really control the board, and you wanted actions that didn't remove your Maui Sharks. That's why a sliving of the B prepared happened. I've actually removed one of the Dragonfires for Lose the Way. Serves a similar functionality in killing characters, since you can more than likely challenge whatever's exerted on your opponent's side of the field with Maui itself, which then refuels the Maui because you then exert something and can reuse it. But also is a cheaper effect and an inkable. That deck had a lot of uninkables. It had like 16 inkables. I think this is still 15, but 15 is better than 16, so we'll go with that. But I think the split there we see with Genie, Merlin is correct. I think that's what we should be seeing going forward, along with Elsa and Maui both being 5 costs that help contest the board in a lot of ways. Medusa and Maui helping your removal count, and a lot of the other aggressive elements there still being present. 1 copy of Peter Pan, Shadowfinder, I believe his name is. Giving your Maui Rush is pretty impressive. Giving your evasive characters Rush, which was not present in that deck list, I think, that I saw. But is also good at checking, Diablo. This deck's kind of been the same. It didn't really gain too much. I think the previous expansion, it gained nothing. Actual nothing, maybe. Maybe Elsa was the only card, I think. But this one, getting Maui and Genie really does help quite a bit. It does make the deck more versatile, and being able to play an aggressive role. Genie has been a problem. It's a very strong card, and it's a card I expect to see. Why we see a rise of Amethyst and maybe a downswing of Ruby Sapphire because of its weakness into Ruby Amethyst. However, with this deck, cards that this deck doesn't really want to play against, I would say sometimes Green Steel discard can be an issue. It really does have the ability to snowball. Hidden Cove is a problem, stopping brawls from making use of anything really good, and depending on how aggressive the decks will be, I think their list wasn't even playing any crabs, which I found a little surprising, just because of Hidden Cove picking up in popularity. It's really something that needs to be answered if brawls are going to do their thing. But Green Steel has been always a little bit of a difficult time with this. It was much more so when Bucky existed, because that was kind of a nightmare card to play against. But Genie does help quite a bit there. But I would say this deck's worst matchup may be Amber Steel Songs in a lot of ways. Whole New World and Naveen are just very powerful in getting around that, kind of everything that's going on with this deck, just ignoring what your opponent's doing and kind of going pedal to the metal. Certainly not a buy or anything like that, not horrendous, but it is a strong deck into this. And if I could choose, I wouldn't want to play against it. And also this deck may struggle a little bit against a more aggressive version of the deck, whether it be the Ruby Amethyst Burn deck, or Emerald Amethyst, which we looked at before, which has Go-Go Tamagos and things like that, since there will be damage on your characters most likely, unless you be prepared them all away, Kendall. But yes, it is a strong choice. Consistent deck. This is something that's fine, I think, for the LCQs. I wouldn't be looking to take this into Continentals itself. I think that this deck does have a little bit difficult time winning on the draw, which it kind of always has. So in best of 3, this deck is fantastic. In best of 2, it's always struggled a little bit, but performed really well on day 2 by comparison. So we'll see. That could be a judgment call you make, where maybe you're confident enough to do well enough in best of 2 to make the second day, and then from there you have a much better chance at best of 3, because you again, get to play with your food a little bit more, get to know the matchup. And open deck list does change how you feel about this deck as well. If you're open deck list, I think this deck gets a lot better as a choice, just because you get to mulligan more aggressively for the things you need, where you might not know if you need to keep a Flynn to be good against Ruby Sapphire, or need to really look for a 1-drop to make sure you have something in play to check Curse Merfolk or something like that. But solid deck. I like the 1 Dragonfire, 1 Lose the way to work with Maui. The 1 Pan Shadow as well kind of is another Diablo answer, and helps Maui gain Rush 2 if you need to, the Maui Sharkhead. But not too much innovation's gone on with this deck. It is tried and true, a powerful deck, grinds people to a pulp, a lot of bounce effects, a lot of rush, a lot of evasive, a lot of removal, the Jund of the game. But strong deck, for sure. Lastly is a deck that I will certainly see people play, and this is a different variation of it, and briefly something I want to talk about, versions of this deck that I've seen versus this version in front of us here, Ruby Sapphire. The main reason this deck exists in general, and you can argue with me all you want about that, is because of Amber Steel Songs. This deck exists as a counter to it. If you look at Amber Steel Songs matchups across the board, it is the highest win percentage against most every deck except for this deck. It has a dramatically smaller win rate against this deck than any other deck, for sure. That doesn't mean that this deck can't survive in a metagame that doesn't include Amber Steel Songs. It certainly can. It has very powerful cards, but this deck primarily came about as a counter to that. What does that mean? It means some cards people have taken liberties with and removed. A lot of versions of this deck I've seen have no Fishbone Quills. They have How Faro Goes, which I've never really liked when playing this deck, mainly because I've seen a lot of times where even the Dicky Hole deck we've seen, we're just able to get ahead of Be Prepared even if they had 2 ramp effects. They were put off for a turn, they were 1 turn away from Sisu, Be Prepared got peated, and the game ended. And without Fishbone Quill, the ability to play a turn 4 Be Prepared just doesn't exist. A turn 5 Sisu just doesn't really exist, because if you're not doing anything except for accelerating, you're probably going to lose before then. So this version of the deck still has Fishbone Quill, and if we continue to see versions without Fishbone Quill, spoiler, I think that Amber Steel Songs just has a way better matchup, because that's the card you always wanted to remove. We played Bare Necessities in Amber Steel Songs, not to take Be Prepared, because we could probably beat it most of the time, but to stop Fishbone Quill. And when they just immediately had 2, or if they drew 1 as soon as you played the first one, it was kind of devastating and really, a huge tempo loss. They're no longer using Fishbone Quill to help with their wild uninkable count. They've gotten much more tame. This one I think only has 14 uninkables. I can take a look really quick here. But it's a much lower uninkable count, which you kind of have to do when you play Sail the Azurite Sea. Sail the Azurite Sea not only reduces your inkable cost, but also demands you play more ink to make sure you can play a card off of it. 'Cause it's really just -1 card to your deck, play another ink. Is what it looks like. But as we can see here, this deck's gone down on inkables severely, especially with the inclusion of Maui Half Shark. We actually only see 1 copy of Lucky Dime, which is more of a caveat to the fact that we get to play Sail the Azurite Sea than the Maui Half Shark and Pirate's Life interaction. The reason that playing Lucky Dime you played 2 of, because there's always a wild chance that you inked it off of a 1 jump ahead. And when playing that card, you really only wanted to play 1 jump ahead on turn 2, and if you got past that point, often it was just ink for the Fishbone Quill, which is why Lucky Dime, you usually saw 2. Sometimes you want to play 2, and sometimes they could kill it, and you never drew a Tamatoa, and just a good card to have in play at all times on turn 7 maybe, or turn 5, depending on how much you accelerated. But the Pirate's Life interaction between Maui lets you play a little bit of defense while gaining lore and closing out the game. Maui having incidental lore gain is also quite strong as well. But 1 Lucky Dime does reduce your uninkable count quite a bit, and Sail being your deck over a card like 1 jump ahead means there's no issue of ever potentially inking it on accident. That includes with cards like Maleficent and Tamatoa. I've seen decks go back up to 4 Maleficent. I think 3 is still fine, especially without the probability of accidentally inking it with the 1 jump ahead or effects like that, where sometimes Maleficent is the best card in a matchup. It really just depends on the matchup. But yes, that's why a lot of the numbers here exist. We see 1 Let It Go, 1 Hideaway, 1 Pirate's Life. They're kind of flexible cards you can find with Vision of the Future. I think the format's a little slow for Vision, so there's only 3. It's going to be inked most of the time, I will say. And I'm always thrilled whenever my opponent plays on turn 2. It's a big fist bump for me. But those cards are things you can recur. You see Hideaway to help deal with Lucky Dimes, Let It Go to help deal with whatever's in play, but also Lilo is a card you want to let it go, which I've had happen to me already in this format. And a Pirate's Life is kind of a way to close things out with Maui if you're really an ability to just gain 3 lore, make them lose 2 in a racing situation, because gets you back into the game. I've considered cards like Thievery just as a cheaper option and also not being a song for Ursula. Very similar effect. I think 2 is significantly greater than 1, so maybe it's right to just play Pirate's Life instead. But you're often singing it with like a Medusa, so you're not really gaining 2 lore, you're really gaining 1 more. Or you're not really gaining more because you're having to sing it versus just play it for 1. It's more the loss of lore that matters than the gaining of lore, to be honest. But this deck also here, Vitalisphere has been a big inclusion, I think, with Maui Half Shark. I was playing it even before then just because I thought it was kind of necessary for Tamatoas to be able to take out Queen's Castles. The interaction between Vitalisphere on 10 ink and Tamatoa being played, if it was, Vitalisphere eaten by a Hiram early on, it exists in your discard to be returned with Tamatoa, played and activated to then challenge a Queen's Castle. We've seen less Queen's Castles, but I think combining a lot of your cards with helping challenge certain things, like having a Sisu be able to take out a character that may be in play, along with a Diablo that might be on a Cove, being able to rush for 3 with Evasive is pretty strong. And of course, Maui Half Shark being evasive, basically being able to challenge anything if that thing is in play on 7 ink is quite strong as well. This is kind of the deck list I would go towards if I was to play this deck, which I'm going to go ahead and say I'm probably on 0% chance to play this deck. It's not my play style. I'm not saying it's a bad deck, but it's not something I enjoy playing, and I really like to enjoy my games when I play. It is a very powerful deck, and I would play it in testing as much as people want, but in tournament setting, I think I would hate myself if I played a deck like this, because I will not do well, and I'll be mad that I played it. But yeah, this is a version I think is still very strong. Again, leaning in towards the ability to accelerate, and also Fishbone Quill to propel you to late game cards much quicker than otherwise. I respect how far I'll go. I respect Sailor and Din and their decision not to play Fishbone Quill. I maybe am skewed in my perspective because of how I feel about Amber Steel Songs, and the fact that if they're stopping playing Quill, then I want to play Songs again, which maybe is a reason to play Amber Steel Songs, because maybe they're not playing it right now. But I think that is too big of a risk not to take, and Fishbone Quill is still a very strong card. It is weaker this matchup, I would say. I mean, this deck in general, I will say basically what you want to avoid when playing this deck is anything with Amethyst in it. So Amethyst Steel, Emerald Amethyst, Ruby Amethyst, all things you don't want to play against. You really got to prey on the Amber Steel, the Green Steel, mostly those 6, and maybe Blue Steel depending on your perspective, but I don't think that's the case as much. But you have a game against everything really, except for like Hyper Aggro, you probably are going to lose. The Dwarf in my deck, I did lose to Ruby Sapphire, but they were playing the Rush Queen, and that was unexpected, and they had it in both games on turn 2, games 2 and 3, and they were playing 1 copy of it, so a little unfortunate there. But I do think it's, the Amber Steel Dwarf in my deck is favored into this type of deck, much less so than Amber Steel Songs, but they both have their merit in some ways. But strong deck, powerful effects. It is very forgiving, I will say. If you are inexperienced with the format, you haven't played in a while, you maybe qualified in Lille or Atlanta, haven't played Lorcana since, this is probably a good deck for you because it's not too difficult to play, meaning a lot of your turns are kind of mapped out as far as how much ink you can use per turn, and your cards are powerful, so they are very forgiving. But yeah, this is about where I'd be at. And those are the 7 decks. I mean, in all honesty, again, dodging the Amethyst decks is one of this deck's key ways to win. There are some Amethyst decks you'll be fine against, depending on how aggressive they are or not, but I'm talking about the Hyper Aggro decks you have no shot against. But I don't really expect to see any Hyper Aggro decks because of the prevalence of Steel. Steel has kept down the Hyper Aggro decks pretty much the entire time the game has been out. And yeah, this has been kind of a deep dive into all the decks I expect to see play against, my versions of them specifically. They've some inspiration between what people are playing in the Cross-Continental Challenge, on what I expect to see in people, how they're going to adapt this week leading up to the event as well. And yeah, my pick to play would be this deck. Again, I think I have game against everything, and I've enjoyed this color pair, and Kita's been impressive as far as changes go for the deck, and giving it more staying power against some of the mid-range decks that use characters to kind of control the mid to late game. I think there was a game against Moyne where you could see I literally had to throw away a Piglet, Lawrence, and Daisy just into a board of foxes and goats because I had no other choice and I had to make them quest. If I had a key to that turn, the game would have been over. They couldn't kill anything, and the game would have ended. And you really kind of want a haymaker in some ways to draw to, right? You got to have some outs in some situations where if you're all 4 of the other cards that aren't keyed in this deck, you really have nothing like very game-changing to play. Pete's your best bet, and Pluto, but those can be dealt with. But yeah, that'd be my choice to play. If I was playing the Continental event this weekend in Europe, this is what I'd play. I am not, unfortunately. I know some people from North America are going to play in the LCQs. Good luck to them. I think Zan's playing him. Good luck there. I imagine playing Green Steel. I have no idea, but that'd be where I would guess his head would be at. But until then, I'm going to be watching. I'm going to be paying attention, and I'm playing something that you've seen here probably at the Charles Collectible. I think it's 8K, but I still think first place is $3,000, so we'll see. But till next time, thanks for everyone tuning in. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. If there's any decks you think I missed, for sure, let me know, because I'm interested to hear people's perspectives. And yeah, there's a lot of decks people could play. I haven't covered all of them. There's no way I could. But till then,